Good morning, everyone. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Lakshmi Krishnan, the faculty director of our Georgetown Medical Humanities Initiative and an assistant professor of medicine and affiliate joint faculty in English. In addition to her expertise as a physician, she's a cultural historian and medical humanities scholar, and she joined our community this past summer. So Lakshmi, thank you very much for taking the time to be here with us today. And as I mentioned, you're the faculty director of our Georgetown Medical Humanities Initiative, which is a new interdisciplinary effort that connects our college, our Georgetown Humanities Initiative, and our Georgetown School of Medicine. Can you share a little bit about the initiative and its goals and what you hope it's able to accomplish in the time ahead?
Yes, thank you so much, President DeGioia, for inviting me. I'm so excited about this conversation. Just as a bit of background on the medical humanities, as a field, it was born out of a moment really in the 1960s and 70s where the division of healthcare and the human, right, the arts, the humanities, the social sciences seemed particularly stark. And this was having real impact in the alienation between one of the largest fields and industries in the world and the very people it was meant to serve. And so the medical humanities movement sought to reunify the arts and sciences and provide a more holistic and humanitarian approach to care. But in reality, as those of us who are humanists know, this relationship has always existed. Healing and care have always been bound up with spirituality, religion, philosophy, art, literature, history, those big, profound existential questions that exist on the borders of life and death, of health and illness, how we suffer, how we come together, what we value, that these are all interconnected is really no surprise to any of us. And how 2020, this year, and our pandemic have made this abundantly clear. And of course, I'm new to Georgetown, but what I very quickly learned is that Georgetown has a long history of caring about this interconnection of cura personalis and paying attention to the needs of the individual, the other, and the community at large. As our own physician ethicist Edmund Pellegrino said, medicine is the most humane of sciences, the most empiric of arts, and the most scientific of humanities. And I think that's just a lovely phrase. And that's how I introduce medical humanities to my students as well. So it was out of this fertile terrain that the Georgetown Medical Humanities Initiative arose. And our mission is simple, but I should say, it's simple but very complicated, obviously, to bring the fields of health, humanities, arts, and social sciences into conversation to answer the big, profound, hard questions of our day. And it's also meant to bring students and faculty together to collaborate creatively, to build community across the university and in Washington, D.C., and to really develop the next generation of leaders in health education and research, because it's so clear that scientific knowledge alone is insufficient, that we must think also with the methods of the humanities and social sciences and develop our core values of equity and justice and be critical and reflective, all of these things that are kind of the toolkit of the humanities. So in terms of the more detailed things that we do, we offer medical humanities classes that are at the intersections of these fields. They're really innovative. They bring medical and college and nursing faculty together in co-teaching and team teaching. We have undergraduates, nursing, and medical students together in the same room. So you can only imagine the conversations that engenders. We have events that do much the same. For example, just this fall, we held an event that was co-sponsored with the Lab for Global Performance and Politics and the School of Medicine on Angels in America, Tony Kushner's play, and the kind of resonance of the HIV pandemic during our own pandemic. And in this, professional DC actors were performing scenes from the play interspersed with commentary from medical and health equity experts. So just those kinds of intersections and community building. We also support mentored student research. So we just announced this past week the undergraduate and graduate recipients of the inaugural Medical Humanities Fellowships for research in this area. So all of this is just, it's a long answer to your question, but to try to kind of reshape and reimagine the ways in which we think about and approach health and care.
Thank you. Thank you. That's terrific. So share with us the link, literature and the humanities. How do they help us deepen our understanding of medicine and vice versa?
Yeah, absolutely. During this pandemic, strangely enough, been thinking about this even more, but through the lens of poetry. I think, like many of us, I've actually been relying on poetry a good deal. My area of specialty is, as you said, cultural history and Victorian novels. So this is a bit of a departure for me, but this question really reminds me of this line from John Keats's poem, The Fall of Hyperion, where he says, "Sure, a poet is a sage, a humanist, physician to all men." And this line has just stayed with me over the past 8 to 9 months: a humanist, physician to all men, all humans. So, this idea that the kingdom of letters and the kingdom of healing are so intertwined, that healing involves ministering to the soul, the spirit, and the mind, as well as the body, that it takes not only analytical skill to do both of these things, to write, to read, to metabolize words, letters, but a radical act of imagination. And I think we need more of that in healthcare. Now, Keats, of course, trained as a physician, and though many read him as kind of anti-medicine or anti-science, I actually counter that his medical training is inextricable from his literary output, that he witnessed suffering, that he himself was a patient, that he was chronically ill from tuberculosis, and this shimmering sympathy that we read in Keats for, kind of all of humankind is part of this. I also have been thinking about other favorite poets like Bettina Judd, whose collection from 2014, Patient, draws on her own experiences of surgery and links these to the historical archive of experimentation on Black women, which is a horrific legacy from which many huge and lauded medical discoveries arose. So we have to know that history. Or Ada Limon, who's a poet who had scoliosis from a young age and writes, "My crooked spine unspooled a bit, I could breathe again and move more in a body unclouded by pain." So I use all of these examples, President DeJoy, to say that at their heart, as you know, the humanities can help us appreciate the individual, the variable, the complex, that they help us read more deeply. And by that, I mean reading text, but also reading bodies, reading emotions, that they require us to take ourselves out of ourselves and inhabit others' bodies and experiences. They also they equip us with a way to critique, to kind of meta reflect. And then in reverse, that medical and health practices, as again, we've seen to great effect in 2020, deepen our understanding of how immediate and how relevant such ways of thinking and knowing are, because they are occurring at the front line. There's a firsthand kind of knowledge there, and it's urgent.
Yeah. Now you've been teaching, so you taught a course this fall called Pandemics, Texts, and Contexts, an interdisciplinary approach to understanding pandemics. Share with us some of the more interesting reflections that have come to you from teaching that class.
Yeah, absolutely. This class has been enormously fun to teach. I always wanted to teach a course on epidemics, but this seemed like a particularly good time. I think, I think that, when I'm trying to distill the great reflections of this class, one of the big things has been the great paradox of pandemics, that they are simultaneously universal, but also remarkably individual experiences. And my students keep returning to this or variations on this theme numerous times as we've moved from Albert Camus' The Plague to cholera in 19th century India, to the global HIV pandemic and Angels in America. And now we're actually reading speculative and dystopian fiction like Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. And we've kind of bounced between the fictional and the historical. But my students have been really attuned to who pandemics make the most vulnerable and why the ways in which pandemics unveil our deficiencies and kind of social fractures and inequalities is so important. And I've been really struck by this because my students whose young lives have been upended by this pandemic care so deeply about the plight of others, whether they're reading about historical or contemporary relevance of this. We've also had some really fascinating discussions on pandemic responses from the fictional to the historical, and that these often appear in a similar pattern or genre over and over. So, what historian Charles Rosenberg calls the dramaturgic form of plagues. But one other thing I'll say is that we've also had our own meta narrative at work while we're talking about these other pandemics, which is our own experience and our own subjectivity and reality kind of layered on top. So, for example, when we were talking about 19th century cholera, we held a class debate where the students had to take positions either as miasma theorists or germ theorists, kind of early John Snow. And they were arguing about the causes of a mystery illness, which might be airborne or held in the vapors or waterborne. And they were proposing mitigation strategies. But because of our own COVID-19 experience and the kind of unraveling of that, and as our own knowledge of COVID-19 continues to develop, I think there was a real urgency to this class at this time and these discussions at this time.
Sure, sure. Now, you've mentioned some of the poets who've brought you consolation during this period and some of the books that are part of your course this fall. Are there other readings that you might recommend to our larger community that might be particularly relevant at this time?
Yeah, absolutely. As you know, and as you mentioned, I've been rereading a lot of plague or plague adjacent texts. So I do have a few, one that I actually am teaching, but one that I didn't get to teach. The first is Mary Shelley's Last Man, which is just an amazing work. It's perhaps the first English post-apocalyptic novel. And of course, Shelley's mostly known for Frankenstein. But what's so interesting to me in rereading this now is that even if one hasn't read Last Man, one has, because it has been reshaped and has had so many afterlives in
Right.
later science and dystopian literature, science fiction and dystopian literature, I should say. And it's really good on these ideas of political and social interconnection and global crisis responses. And then a novel that I'm actually teaching, we're about to start reading it, is Ling Ma's Severance, which is written almost 2 centuries later, but is equally fascinating. It's a satirical novel, and wrapped in this pandemic novel are analyses of capitalism and immigration and genre fiction. So those are two that I've been returning to a lot, but I've also been rereading some classics in history of medicine. So books like Nancy Tome's Gospel of Germs, which looks at how the new bacteriology and germ theory were taken up in the 19th century in the American middle class, and where women and domestic reformers in particular played a significant role. So that's been very interesting for me. And also I love Samuel Roberts' Infectious Fear, which looks at the tuberculosis crisis in the early 20th century in Baltimore in particularly, and how politics and public health responses intersected with a segregated society. And I do think that I guess my kind of pitch for reading these books is also that rereading this history, while it can be a bit anxiety provoking, is also grounding for me in a certain way. Helps me know where we might be in the plot, to use a literary metaphor, to kind of give an orientation and see a path forward, and maybe a place where the road can fork. So for me personally, it offers hope as well, rereading these books. And
Oh,
then, as you said, I've been reading a lot of other poetry, Derek Walcott, Constantine Kabafi. I think I'm reading a lot of maritime poems because I feel a little landlocked right now, just like I think many of us. So just anything that's about the sea and kind of travel and mythic. So highly recommend any of that.
thank you. Thank you. Now, you're currently working on a new book, The Doctor and the Detective, A Cultural History of Diagnosis. Can you tell us a little bit about what the book's about and what drew you to the subject?
Yeah, absolutely. The book is about the rise and co-production of medical doctors and detectives in America and the UK from the early 19th to about the mid 20th century. And I got interested in it when I was actually in residency training to be an internal medicine physician. I realized that the act of detective work was such a ubiquitous metaphor in medicine. It was part of how we learned, how we were tested and examined, and also the way we thought of ourselves as doctors, being kind of medical detectives. And I began to wonder how this came about, but also what problems such an idea might generate. So the book argues that we can't understand diagnosis as a practice now without excavating its deep connections to detection and investigative work. Because prior to that early 19th century historical moment I'm talking about, though there were certainly overlaps, what is now basically an invisible metaphor of the doctor as detective didn't really exist. For us now, the connection's so obvious because we've gotten so used to it. You know, Sherlock Holmes was based on a doctor. We have House MD, this kind of snarky medical detective, the medical mystery column in the New York Times on diagnosis. So this metaphor is just living and kind of around us, almost like a miasma. And the connection seems obvious, but it's not. It's actually the product of a number of cultural and historical forces. And one of the other arguments I make is that it's really important to look at this shared lineage because it helps us understand how we do diagnosis today. What are its pitfalls? What are its biases and errors? What role does the medical practitioner play in diagnosis? And how does this intersection between diagnosis and investigative work both in the patient's favor, but also potentially against them? So that's the kind of, I think, importance of this historical lineage.
Oh, that's terrific. And I can't thank you enough for taking this time for this conversation. It's been great catching up and learning so much about your work. And thank you for your leadership. In closing, is there a message you'd like to share with our community?
Yeah, I mean, thank you again for giving me this opportunity, and it's been just a delight to talk with you. In terms of a closing message, I think those of us who do history rarely use the word unprecedented because so few things actually are. But I do think this year and this pandemic has, at least for many of us, been unprecedented in our lifetimes. And I think so much about our students who are experiencing this at such a critical juncture. I think we all know that this will change all of us in ways that we probably can't even begin to imagine. But what I hope is that it will also change our community and our world in positive and meaningful ways. That when things settle back, that it won't be just a return to the ordinary, this kind of release of a collective sigh and business as usual, but that we will be galvanized by the challenges that have surfaced this year. And so I'll end with a quote by someone from the country of my birth, India, Jawaharlal Nehru, who said, "Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge, not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially." And I think he says it better than I ever could.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Again, thank you for taking the time to be with us this morning. And I look forward to being with all of you again soon. Take care of yourselves and take care of everyone around you. For every Hoya, everywhere.